So we're going to move on to the methods section right now. And the methods section is the section that I, as an epidemiologist, read in extreme detail. I go through it and I comb through and I try to understand a lot of information. And the reason that I try to understand all that information is, if you recall the information from HSC 201, your research methods class, for every research question there are many, many different types of study designs you can use to actually understand that particular study, that particular research question. And because there are so many different options, what I'm looking for here is, did the authors select a method that would maximize both internal validity and external validity? So as an epidemiologist, when I'm trying to assess those things, I need to ascertain that information from the methods section. Now, usually when I go through a methods section, there are several details that I'm looking to pour over in a lot of detail. That usually starts with the sample section. Usually it starts off with the researchers describing where they ascertained their data from, who they collected the information from, what size the sample was used, and those particular details are important because they may suggest something about selection bias or the possibility of selection bias. The next thing that I look for, and I comb through the details in the methods section, is information about how the exposure and outcome were measured. So we need to know what the exposure and the outcome was. I need to know whether they used a valid method, but also what I'm looking for is, did the way they classify the information, was that appropriate, or categorize the information, was that appropriate? Did they collect information on also subsequent confounders? And that information is all important because that may tell us something about, or that may indicate the possibility of misclassification bias. The next section, what I usually look for, is the actual statistical analysis section. And that tells us a little bit about what analytic methods did the researchers use to actually study this research question. And in particular, I look for, were the multivariate models that the researchers selected, were they appropriate given the type of data that they had? I also look for, did the authors adjust for potential confounders? And as you recall from your HSC 201 class, confounders are these third variables that essentially distort the relationship between your exposure and outcome relationship. And so adjusting for those particular confounders can help minimize that distortion or the confusion, and helps us better understand what is the exposure-outcome relationship. Other things that I look for in that particular section are, did the authors conduct a sensitivity analysis? In particular, sensitivity analysis can really just indicate that the authors were very thorough and they considered all possible explanations. And other things that I look for are mediation and effect modification. Okay, so now that you have an understanding of what we're looking for in a method section, we'll actually go into the method section and try to pick out some of those details. So I remember that there are two cohorts being used, the Nurses' Health Study, and I know they indicate that it is a prospective cohort. And originally, when the data were collected, there were a possibility of over 120,000 females who were registered nurses who could participate in the study. They were ages 30 to 55 at baseline, which the baseline exam was in 1976. In addition to using the Nurses' Health Study, these particular researchers also used the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. And this is also a prospective cohort study, even though it's not indicated as prospective cohort. It is also a prospective cohort. And it's not quite as large as the Nurses' Health Study, with just over 50,000. It has a similar age group to that of the Nurses' Health Study, but it is just slightly a little bit older, and so you can see that the age group is 40 to 75. So how the researchers collected information from these nearly 150 to 60,000 individuals was through biennial male questionnaires. Biennial means every 2 years. And these questionnaires included a lot of information, including medical history, lifestyle, and behaviors. Now, as a nutrition epidemiologist, I know a lot about the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study without having to read this. I typically know that they are obviously well educated as registered nurses. The Health Professionals Follow-Up Study usually includes a lot of physicians, and so these particular individuals are typically well educated, higher socioeconomic status, and also here they also indicate that many, more than 95% of the participants were of white European descent. And so what this first sentence is telling me that the Nurses' Health Study began in 1976 and the Health Professional Follow-Up Study began in 1986. But they didn't use all of those participants or information starting at that time point, because what we know is data on fried food consumption was first assessed in 1984 and in 1986 for both of the cohort studies. And so this is an inclusion criteria telling us when they started to use the data from this particular study. What the remaining part of this paragraph is telling us is there were a lot of available participants, or a lot of participants who were included in this, or who were part of the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, but they didn't necessarily use information from all of those individuals. And this tells us some exclusion criteria, why they excluded certain individuals. And you can see who they excluded. They excluded individuals who had particular diseases at the beginning of the study, or when they started collecting fried food information. They excluded people who had reported unusual energy intake. And the reason for excluding people who had unusual energy intake, and you can see how that's defined, is typically because when you see that unusual, people who consume less than 800 or greater than 4,200 calories, typically they may be misreporting information on the food frequency questionnaire, or that may represent that they had some other, they don't represent the typical population. So we typically exclude that, and that's very common in nutrition epidemiology studies. The last thing that you can see that they, or the two other things that they exclude is people who did not answer the food frequency questionnaire. The food frequency questionnaire is how you obtain dietary information, so if you don't answer the food frequency questionnaire, we don't know anything about your exposure levels. And the other thing that they exclude is subjects who only replied to the baseline questionnaire or had unknown mortality or disease status during the follow-up. And the reason to exclude them, just like we exclude people from food, those with missing data from the food frequency, is because we don't know what happens to them. So we need to exclude them because we have no idea what their outcome levels are. Now, based on this inclusion and exclusion criteria, you can see what the sample size for this particular analysis is. So there are just over 70,000 women and just over 40,000 men who are available for analyses. And then those were the people who were started the study that we had information on. And then what this sentence tells us is among those 70,000 plus women and the 40,000 plus men, how many of them were observed over the remaining years of the study. So over the years of follow-up, how many of them did we observe, and then how many of them did we lose because we just lost them, we don't know, we couldn't follow up with them. And you can see here that it's greater than 90%, and so that indicates that retention was very, very good for this particular study design.